On the night of April 17, 1943, the tension across southern England could be felt in the marrow of every bone. The moon hung pale and indifferent as air raid sirens wound their mournful cry through the blackout. In dimly lit bunkers and on shadowed rooftops, weary British eyes scanned the darkness, bracing for the thunder of another Luftwaffe attack. For months, London had lived by the rhythm of bombs and prayers, each night carving deeper lines into the faces of its defenders. Yet, tonight felt different. A chill of uncertainty and a flicker of hope mingled in the cool spring air. At exactly 22:03, the familiar blips of incoming German bombers lit up the Allied radar screens. Dozens of aircraft, flying in tight formation, arrowing towards the coastline. The radar operators, seasoned but never jaded, tracked the blips with practiced precision. Anti-aircraft crews stood ready, nerves taut. In the underground war rooms, commanders bent over maps, preparing for another long, punishing night. Then, just as the first waves neared the white cliffs, something extraordinary happened. The radar screens began to flicker, then blur. Blips faded, sputtered, and then vanished altogether, swallowed by static. On the ground, spotters reported only the deep silence of empty skies. For a heartbeat, it seemed as though the Luftwaffe had simply disappeared. An entire fleet, erased. Allied officers exchanged bewildered glances. Had the Germans discovered a new cloaking technology? Was it a trick, a trap, or an unthinkable miracle? For endless seconds, silence reigned, broken only by the staccato rattle of typewriters and distant footsteps echoing through concrete corridors. As the reality sank in, jubilation rippled through the ranks. Soldiers shouted, officers cheered, and, above all, a collective exhale swept through a nation battered by years of war. Meanwhile, across the Channel, German aircrews radioed frantic. Contradictory reports, navigation gone haywire. Radio signals scrambled, entire squadrons flying blind. In Berlin, the command staff pored over maps, their confidence shaken. How could a meticulously planned raid vanish without a trace? Paranoia grew. Were they outwitted, betrayed, or victims of some diabolical British weapon? For British intelligence, the moment was as thrilling as it was mystifying. To the public, it would remain a classified rumor, a silent victory with no parade. But behind locked doors, a handful of officers knew the truth. This was no accident, and certainly no miracle. It was the result of a daring, almost impossible gambit. An operation hatched in secrecy, led by a man many had called a madman. What invisible hand had plucked the bombers from the sky? How could science, deception, and a streak of wild genius change the course of a continent-wide war? To answer that, we must turn back the clock to a time when Britain's back was to the wall, and a desperate gamble would set the stage for the night the Luftwaffe vanished. In the bleak winter of 1942, Britain was a nation bruised and battered, its spirit tested each night by the unrelenting fury of the Luftwaffe. For over 2 years, German bombers had painted the sky with fire. Night after night, searchlights clawed at the darkness, flak cannons thundered, and ordinary citizens huddled in cellars and tube stations, counting the seconds between each distant explosion. Entire city blocks were reduced to rubble. Children were evacuated from their homes, and families marked each other's safety with chalk tallies on the walls of makeshift shelters. The war had become not just a battle for land, but a test of endurance, hope, and imagination. Yet, amid the devastation, a fragile thread of hope remained, woven from the promise of a new technology. Radar. Britain's chain home system, a latticework of steel towers and humming transmitters, could peer beyond the horizon and spot incoming planes before they crossed the coast. It was a marvel of science, a secret shield that gave Britain its first taste of advantage. The victories of the Battle of Britain had been owed, in no small part, to this invisible net. guiding Spitfires to intercept the enemy, sparing cities from even greater destruction. In every pub and factory, rumors whispered of the Wizard War, a secret duel between scientists in hidden laboratories far from the front. But as 1942 unfolded, the winds began to shift. German engineers, relentless and brilliant in their own right, were closing the gap. Reports filtered in. The Luftwaffe was deploying new tactics, jamming frequencies, scattering aluminum window strips to blind the radars. British operators watched in horror as their screens filled with ghostly echoes. False blips, confusion, uncertainty. The precious seconds of warning that radar once gave were now slipping away. With each successful German raid, confidence in the system faltered. Was the Wizard's magic failing? Or worse, had the enemy learned to wield it for themselves? Within the walls of the Air Ministry, the mood turned grim. Behind every casual salute and stiff uniform, anxiety simmered. High command convened in hushed meetings, voices low and faces drawn. The stakes were excruciating. Britain's survival hinged on technology, and that technology was no longer invincible. What options remained when science itself could be unraveled? As despair crept in, a dangerous thought began to take root. If the enemy was mastering Britain's secrets, perhaps it was time to fight not with steel or circuits, but with shadows and lies. Deception, once the realm of magicians and stage performers, became a military imperative. Could the British turn the Luftwaffe's arrogance against itself? Could the enemy be made to see what wasn't there and miss what mattered most? The stakes could not have been higher. Every decision risked catastrophe. If the Germans realized the trick, they would redouble their attacks. If the ruse failed, thousands more might die. But desperate times demanded desperate measures. In smoky basement rooms, intelligence officers drew up schemes with code names as strange as fairy tales. Operation Bodyguard, Fortitude, and now, a new plan still too secret for ink and paper. Yet even as Britain's finest minds debated, argued and despaired, a rumor began to flicker through the labyrinth of wartime London. Some spoke of a scientist whose ideas were too wild for the laboratories, a man dismissed as an eccentric, perhaps even a lunatic by his colleagues. He saw the war not just as a clash of machines, but as a contest of perception, belief, and imagination. As bombs rained down and hope seemed lost, the faintest glimmer of an alternative began to pulse beneath the surface. A gamble, impossible, risky, perhaps even reckless, was taking shape in the minds of those who had nothing left to lose. Only deception, audacious and invisible, could turn the tide now. But as London burned, a rumor surfaced of one scientist who saw the war differently, and in the crucible of crisis, it would be his vision, dismissed by many as madness, that would offer Britain one last chance to outwit the darkness. In the smoky heart of wartime Cambridge, far from the thunder of bombs and the rigid discipline of the Air Ministry, a man hunched over a tangle of wires and glass tubes, speaking softly to the ghosts in the static. Dr. Geoffrey Langford was the sort of figure who inspired both laughter and unease. A mop of unkempt hair, spectacles forever sliding down his nose, ink stains on his cuffs, and a gaze that seemed to drift far beyond the walls of his cluttered laboratory. He was, in every way, a contradiction, celebrated for his early brilliance, and quietly pitied for never quite fitting in. Langford's world was the invisible, the dance of electrons, the hum of the ether, the secret language of radio waves that knit the world together in ways most could never imagine. As a child, he'd spent evenings in his father's study, tuning crackling receivers to catch voices bouncing off the ionosphere from Paris, Moscow, Cairo. It was a passion that bordered on obsession, one that gave solace when his mother died and his father, once a rising star at the Royal Society, fell into scandal and obscurity. Geoffrey learned early that genius was fragile. and reputations could be erased overnight. By 1942, Langford had carved out a lonely niche as the university's radio wizard, his office overflowing with blueprints, battered radios, and journals filled with frantic scribbles. His colleagues admired his intellect. He could calculate the frequency of a transmitter by ear. But they whispered about his absent-mindedness, his wild theories, the eccentric habits that had cost him promotions, and, some said, his peace of mind. He'd been laughed out of more than one ministry meeting, called the mad scientist by those who never understood the urgency that burned behind his eyes. But war, as Langford knew, has a way of turning yesterday's outcasts into tomorrow's heroes, or scapegoats. One rainy afternoon, as he scribbled equations in a fit of insomnia, a knock rattled his door. Standing in the corridor was Colonel Andrew Hale, an intelligence officer with a reputation for seeing opportunity in unlikely places. Hale, sharp-eyed and unsentimental, had heard whispers of Langford's latest experiment, a theory that radar could do more than detect planes. It could create illusions, bend enemy perceptions, and, perhaps, make the Germans see things that weren't there. Langford, weary from rejection but too stubborn to surrender, outlined his vision. He spoke of constructing false echoes on German radar, of crafting electronic ghosts that could make an empty field look like a fortress, or vice versa. Hale listened, one eyebrow raised, then offered a proposal so audacious it left Langford reeling. The War Office was desperate. If Langford could turn theory into reality, he'd have funding, a hand-picked team, and near-total secrecy. If he failed, the world would never know. The task was simple in its impossibility. Outwit the greatest scientific minds of Nazi Germany, and do it with little more than wires, vacuum tubes, and imagination. Langford hesitated. Memories of his father's disgrace flickered. Would he be remembered as a visionary, or as another Langford ruined by hubris? But the air outside was thick with smoke and fear. The choice, in the end, was no choice at all. He accepted. The next weeks blurred into a fever of activity. Langford recruited his allies: Clara Miles, a radio engineer with nerves of steel; Sammy Patel, a mathematics prodigy from Bombay, who could solve cryptic ciphers as fast as he could tell a joke; and a handful of oddballs who believed, as he did, that science could be a weapon of mischief as well as survival. Their laboratory became a sanctum of invention and argument. They tinkered with circuits, built strange antennae in the darkness, scribbled wild designs on blackboards. The corridors echoed with laughter, cursing, and, on late nights, music from an old gramophone. But as word of their project spread, so did skepticism. Senior officers rolled their eyes at the lunatic crew. Academics dismissed Langford's proposals as dangerous fantasy. More than once, funding was threatened, and Hale was warned he'd lose his career if he backed the wrong horse. "Why?" one general sneered. "Should the fate of England rest on the shoulders of a man no one believes?" Yet, in the privacy of his study, Langford wrestled with another demon. Among his father's papers, he'd found notes on an early experiment, one that ended in public humiliation after the elder Langford claimed to have detected signals no one else could verify. Was Geoffrey doomed to repeat the same mistake, to chase phantoms while real bombs fell? He feared failure, but feared being forgotten even more. The day finally came when their first prototype, a sprawling mess of wires, amplifiers, and makeshift transmitters, was ready for trial. As Langford threw the final switch, the machine hummed, pulsed, and for a moment did nothing. The onlookers smirked. Hale avoided his gaze. But just as hope seemed lost, a burst of interference rippled across the test radar screen. A ghostly echo where none should exist. A heartbeat of silence. Then the room erupted. His first experiments were dismissed as lunacy, until a single test changed everything. And in that moment, The shadow of the mad scientist stretched across a continent at war, hinting at miracles and dangers yet to come. Langford's victory in the laboratory did not buy him peace. It only opened the gates to a new kind of war, fought in secret, waged with shadows. The official go-ahead from the ministry arrived with a warning. One mistake, and you'll hang by your own cables. No one had ever tried to build a phantom radar array before, certainly not in the way Langford imagined it. The stakes were absolute. Either their illusions would hold, or the enemy would tear them apart. Their workshop was moved to a remote airfield, surrounded by barbed wire and patrolled by men in overcoats. There, Langford's ragtag team set to work. There was Clara Miles, whose calm under pressure kept everyone sane when circuits burned out and tempers flared. Sammy Patel, endlessly cheerful, scribbling equations that seemed to bend the very laws of nature. And new arrivals, ex-radio pirates, theater illusionists, code breakers, each bringing a quirk of genius or madness that somehow fit the mission's needs. Langford believed that radar, by its very nature, could be made to lie. Standard British radar arrays, massive, steel-limbed chain home towers, sent out regular pulses that bounced off approaching aircraft, lighting up operator screens with telltale blips. The team's plan was as outlandish as it was elegant. Instead of merely listening for echoes, what if they transmitted false ones? If they could project carefully timed, convincing signals back at their own radars, or, more daring still, jam or mimic the German Freya and Würzburg radar systems, they could conjure fleets out of thin air, redirect bombers, and sow chaos among the Nazi command. But the technical obstacles bordered on the insane. The team needed transmitters strong enough to paint convincing ghosts, but subtle enough not to give away their location. They constructed strange, spider-like antennas out of scavenged airplane parts and telephone wire, testing configurations in the dead of night. Clara engineered frequency shifters to match German equipment, working by lamplight until her fingers cramped. Sammy coded elaborate signal patterns that mimicked the signature of real aircraft, sometimes working for days without sleep. Even more critical was timing. If their phantom echoes appeared a split second too late, trained enemy operators would spot the trick. If their signals were too strong, they would draw suspicion. Or worse, a barrage of artillery. Each experiment carried the risk of exposure. The team took to wearing civilian clothes, blending in with local farmers, ever wary of spies or traitors. The line between genius and madness was a narrow wire, and they walked it every day. Langford's mind buzzed with the possibilities. If their ghost radar could fool enemy bombers into veering off course, perhaps they could also convince German intelligence that Britain's defenses were far stronger than reality. He dreamed of moving airfields overnight, of conjuring entire divisions where none existed, of playing chess with Hitler himself. The ministry, desperate and dazzled, granted him wide leeway, but not everyone was convinced. One skeptical officer muttered, "We're gambling the empire on stage magic and equations." Doubts seeped into the team. There were arguments about ethics and strategy. Should they risk civilian lives on a ruse? Was it right to fight lies with lies? Or did that make them as dangerous as the enemy they faced? At night, Langford wandered the airfield, haunted by visions of his father, the man destroyed by a failed experiment. Every setback, a blown fuse, a signal lost in the static, threatened to unravel everything. Yet, in the darkest hours, Clara's steady hand or Sammy's easy laughter would pull him back from despair. Testing the system was an ordeal of nerves. They staged mock attacks, flying battered planes into the radar net to see if their ghosts would fool the watchers in the control tower. More than once, the test pilots, unsung heroes, risked their lives to simulate enemy raids. At first, the results were discouraging. Signals fizzled, patterns broke down, and the radar screens remained stubbornly empty. But Langford refused to give in. He demanded new experiments, urged the team to think wilder, to question everything. "If we only do what's been done before," he insisted, "we'll lose to men who have nothing left to lose." Gradually, the impossible became reality. In one breakthrough test, Clara managed to layer signal ghosts onto real echoes, multiplying a handful of planes into an armada on the radar screen. German monitoring stations, listening from across the channel, picked up the same illusions. Word filtered back through the intelligence networks. The British air defense was everywhere and nowhere, their strength unknowable. Morale in the Luftwaffe began to erode, their pilots grumbling about phantom squadrons and English sorcery. Langford's team knew they had crossed a threshold. Science had become subterfuge, yet every success drew new danger. German codebreakers became obsessed with the mystery signals. Abwehr agents prowled English villages, searching for the source. A suspicious explosion in the workshop one night left the team shaken. Was it sabotage or a careless mistake? Langford began receiving anonymous letters, threats scribbled in broken English. Still, the project pressed forward, because to stop now would mean admitting defeat. As weeks became months, the line between genius and madness blurred. The airfield buzzed with secrets. The team's nerves stretched thin. No one slept easily. Some began to wonder if they were building a weapon or a trap for themselves. But the closer they got to success, the more dangerous the game became. Somewhere in the shadows, unseen eyes were watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And as Langford gazed out over his trembling ghost towers, he sensed the coming storm, one that would test every truth he'd ever known. The night the hoax went live was thick with a kind of suspense even battle-hardened soldiers could feel in their bones. Under the cover of gathering dusk, Langford's team gathered in the cramped control shed, breath fogging in the chill, nerves singing with anticipation and dread. Outside, the phantom towers stood in silent formation, their spidery arms poised to cast shadows across the ether. Orders had come down. Tonight, the experiment would become a weapon. As darkness blanketed the coast, German bombers rose from their French airfields. Their pilots, briefed by intelligence and assured by their own radar crews, believed they had finally outwitted British defenses. The enemy's radar coverage, they were told, was full of holes. Their approach would be swift and unseen. Confidence thrummed in every engine as they thundered across the channel, ready to deliver another night of terror. Inside the British bunker, Langford's fingers hovered over the controls, his eyes darting between the jittering dials and the faces of his exhausted team. At his signal, Clara triggered the first transmission. Across the landscape, invisible beams danced through the air, carefully timed and tuned. Within seconds, the radar screens in Allied command rooms flickered to life. Not with the true positions of the Luftwaffe, but with the ghostly echoes Langford's system had conjured. On paper, it looked like an invasion. Squadrons massing here, diverging there, multiplying like a magician's card trick. British Fighter Command, in on the ruse, sent Spitfire and Hurricane squadrons not to the phantom targets, but to the handful of places the Germans actually threatened. The Luftwaffe, seeing gaps where none existed and safe corridors where traps had been laid, flew straight into ambush after ambush. Anti-aircraft batteries, fed precise data by Langford's ghosts, opened fire with terrifying accuracy. Confusion swept through the German ranks. Planes vanished, formations scattered, radio traffic dissolved into chaos. More than one seasoned pilot later claimed to have seen entire swarms of British fighters appear out of nowhere. Meanwhile, German scientists and intelligence officers hunched over their own equipment, baffled by the signals that flickered and danced across their displays. Ghost squadrons seemed to materialize and vanish without pattern or logic. The airwaves were filled with chatter. Could this be new British technology, or a trick of the ionosphere? Or, some whispered, a sign that the war had entered the realm of the supernatural? Desperate for answers, technical teams tore apart their own radars, searching for faults that didn't exist. Engineers worked around the clock, sleepless and grim, while commanders demanded explanations no one could give. The irony was exquisite, though only a handful on the Allied side could appreciate it. The Germans, priding themselves on their scientific rigor, were undone not by brute force or superior numbers, but by an illusion, an elaborate fiction painted on the very screens they trusted most. For every Luftwaffe pilot who escaped, there were many who returned shaken, swearing the British had found a way to see through the clouds. In the mess halls and briefing rooms, stories grew wilder. British radar could see through steel, read minds, bend time itself. Confidence gave way to suspicion, and suspicion to fear. Langford's team listened in on intercepted transmissions, their exhaustion melting into nervous laughter and disbelief. Each night, the system was refined. Ghosts became subtler, patterns more intricate. Sometimes, they fed the Germans exactly what they wanted to see: empty skies or hopelessly congested defenses, leading them into costly mistakes. Other times, they mimicked the signature of entire air fleets, sowing panic and forcing the enemy to divert resources. The effect rippled up the chain of command. German planners found themselves reacting to shadows, burning fuel and manpower in pursuit of a puzzle that grew only more perplexing. But the cost of deception was steep. Langford slept little, haunted by the burden of responsibility. Every successful trick made the next one riskier. The Luftwaffe's failures did not go unnoticed in Berlin. Reports of inexplicable losses and impossible British maneuvers landed on Hitler's desk, feeding his legendary rage. Rumors swirled that a spy, perhaps even a traitor, was giving away German plans. The Führer demanded answers, and his generals, under withering pressure, vowed to find the saboteurs. Soon, the Gestapo and the Abwehr, the Nazi counterintelligence arms, began to search for explanations beyond the ordinary. They combed through signals intelligence, interrogated prisoners, and unleashed spies across southern England. British intelligence intercepted more chatter, learning that teams of agents had been dispatched to find the source of the illusion. The pressure mounted on Langford's group. One wrong move, one slip of the tongue, could bring the entire apparatus crashing down. At the same time, Hitler's anger grew volatile and unpredictable. He lashed out at his own scientists, accusing them of incompetence and cowardice. The paranoia at the top seeped downward, creating a climate of distrust within the German war machine. Some whispered that the British had developed a new kind of superweapon, a science so advanced it bordered on the magical. Others, desperate for explanations, blamed treachery within their own ranks. Langford watched the unfolding chaos with a mix of triumph and anxiety. Every intercepted message, every confused German report, was a testament to the team's ingenuity, but also a reminder that the enemy was closing in. British intelligence warned of double agents and strange faces in nearby villages. One night, a coded message reached Langford. "They are looking for the ghost makers." The line between hunter and hunted was dissolving fast. Yet for now, the illusion held. The Germans stumbled blindly, the phantom radar guiding them into the jaws of disaster, night after night. The greatest secret of the war was safe, at least for a moment, but the search for the truth was tightening. And in the shadows, danger was drawing ever closer. As the phantom radar continued to confound the Luftwaffe, the tides of war on the home front shifted from adrenaline to anxiety. Hitler's temper became infamous even among his closest advisors, his trust in his own generals decaying with every failed raid. Berlin seethed with suspicion, Sabotage was the word on every tongue. Fingers pointed in all directions, at scientists, pilots, even the highest-ranking officers. Arrests mounted, careers ruined overnight, and some unlucky men simply vanished. Their fates a whispered warning. But while Germany trembled under the weight of paranoia, Langford faced a different kind of torment back in England. What had started as a secret triumph, each night's victory against the Luftwaffe, celebrated in coded messages and silent toasts, slowly transformed into a nightmare. The first shadow fell with a letter. A scrap of paper slid under his door, ink smudged and words clipped in stilted English. "You play with death. Family pays price." It could have been a cruel prank, except for the photograph tucked inside. His young daughter, walking home from school, her head turned as if sensing eyes behind her. Langford's heart thudded with terror. He reported the threat to Colonel Hale, who assigned guards to watch his family and swept Langford's home for listening devices. But safety was an illusion. Rumors of German agents working with British collaborators, double agents slipping unnoticed through the cracks of security, made trust a rare and precious thing. Even in the supposed safety of England, the war pressed in from every side. The cost of genius soon revealed its darker edge. Within his own team, exhaustion and suspicion began to spread. Was their location truly secret? Had someone leaked the details of their project? Sammy, the mathematician, whose laughter once filled late-night shifts, grew quiet and withdrawn. Clara checked her notes with mounting nervousness. Langford, already a haunted man, found his nerves stretched to breaking. He dreaded every phone call, every unexpected knock. His wife's voice trembled when she asked if their daughter was safe. "I'm fighting for the future," he whispered, but the words rang hollow. Nor did comfort come from above. The government that had once handed Langford near-total freedom now demanded results and explanations. Skeptics in the ministry muttered about the risks of letting eccentrics control vital secrets. Some wondered if Langford's team had gone too far, if the Germans' confusion might provoke even greater reprisals, or if the illusion could collapse at any moment and leave Britain exposed. There were suggestions, veiled and otherwise, that Langford might take the fall if things went wrong. Every day brought new threats and new doubts. German broadcasts named him, calling the English magician a war criminal. The British press, starved for headlines, sniffed around for leaks. Through it all, Langford's only solace was the knowledge that, on the battlefield, their deception still held. The Luftwaffe floundered, their resources squandered, their leaders consumed by rage. Each report of a misdirected raid or a failed attack brought momentary relief, yet was quickly drowned out by the next wave of anxiety at home. It was a lonely kind of victory. As Langford gazed out at the gray dawn, he wondered whether his father had felt the same. Vindicated in theory, but hollowed out by the sacrifices demanded in practice. Sometimes he caught his own reflection in a pane of glass and saw not a hero, but a man being swallowed by the very shadows he'd unleashed. The night before the project's final phase, Langford packed away his journals, preparing to disappear into the history books. A name classified, achievements sealed, his face unknown to all but a handful. But as he braced for a quiet exit, a final betrayal loomed in the darkness, threatening to undo everything he'd built and risk not just his life, but the fragile victory bought at such a terrible price. The guns had barely cooled, and the cities still smoldered when the truth began to slip, piece by piece, from the vaults of secrecy into the world outside. At first, it was little more than a rumor, hushed whispers among Allied officers, cryptic nods exchanged by those who had worked in the shadows. But with the war's end, as officials scrambled to piece together the puzzle of victory and defeat, the scale of the deception became impossible to ignore. It began in interrogation rooms, where captured Luftwaffe officers, still dazed by the speed of Germany's collapse, revealed a pattern of bewilderment and fear. "We thought we knew the enemy," confessed one seasoned pilot. But our radar told us lies. The British were everywhere and nowhere. Intelligence analysts mapped the chaos in German Air Command, the squandered sorties, the frantic radio messages, the orders given and cancelled in confusion. Slowly, a portrait emerged of a military machine that had lost its faith, not just in its leaders, but in its own eyes and ears. For years, the Luftwaffe had believed its technology would outpace Britain's defenses. It was an article of faith in Berlin. The Reich's scientists were the best in the world. Yet the Phantom Radar project had cracked the very bedrock of that confidence. Night after night, German squadrons flew into empty skies or straight into traps, their losses mounting, their trust evaporating. By the war's final year, the Luftwaffe was a ghost of its former self, its pilots exhausted, its planners paralyzed by doubt. The Phantom Echoes had not merely deceived, they had broken the rhythm of the enemy's war. As the story became declassified, a different kind of reckoning unfolded in England. Some called it the most brilliant ruse of the entire conflict, a victory achieved not by brute force, but by the courage to challenge the limits of perception and belief. Historians marveled at the audacity. A handful of scientists, engineers, and dreamers working in secrecy had played chess with the world's deadliest regime. It was a lesson in the strange power of ideas, that sometimes the greatest weapons are those you never see. But the cost of that secret, when measured honestly, was almost as great as its triumph. Geoffrey Langford, the mad scientist, emerged from the shadows with his reputation redeemed, but his spirit deeply scarred. He received no public medal, no parade. The official records listed him as a technical advisor, his real work buried in footnotes and sealed files. For years, he battled nightmares of faceless threats and impossible choices, haunted by the knowledge that for every mission saved, another risk had been taken. A family left in danger, a friend's trust broken, a conscience forever bruised. Others on his team fared no better. Clara Miles returned to civilian life, her wartime expertise filed away as classified, her story told only in quiet family gatherings. Sami Patel, the mathematical prodigy, vanished into the burgeoning world of peacetime research. His laughter remembered by colleagues, his contributions nearly lost to history. The world, eager to move on, soon forgot the men and women who had spent their brightest years building ghosts in the dark. And yet, their legacy outlasted memory. The Phantom Radar project changed not only the outcome of the war, but the entire philosophy of air defense. In the years that followed, nations raced to develop new forms of electronic warfare, jamming, spoofing, the manipulation of perception itself. Generals and politicians spoke with new respect of the information war, where reality could be shaped, even invented, with enough imagination and nerve. Some saw it as progress, others as a warning. For Langford, the victory was always double-edged. He had changed history, but at what price? In quiet moments, he would revisit the battered notebooks from those frantic months, pages filled with formulas and desperate sketches, reminders of the fragile line between genius and madness. Sometimes, in the echo of a distant thunderstorm or the static of a late-night radio broadcast, he thought he heard the ghosts of those old illusions, flickering at the edge of the possible. He never stopped believing in the power of questions, the courage to doubt what everyone else accepted as true. That, he realized, was the secret at the heart of the Phantom Radar. Not just outwitting the enemy, but daring to see the world differently, even when it cost more than you could ever have imagined. As the world entered a new era of science and suspicion, Langford's legacy whispered a simple, haunting question. What does it take to change history? And who bears the cost when the shadows finally lift? Decades have passed since the desperate days when Langford and his unlikely band of visionaries conjured phantom fleets out of the airwaves. The world has changed in ways even they could never have predicted. London's streets, once haunted by the wail of sirens, now thrum with the energy of peace and invention. The secrets of the war, once guarded as fiercely as any treasure, have begun to seep into textbooks and documentaries, debated in university halls and replayed in late-night documentaries watched by a new generation. For historians, the Phantom Radar Project is a puzzle piece that explains how a beleaguered island nation outfoxed the might of the Reich. Scholars dissect Langford's work, marveling at the audacity of the plan and the elegance of its execution. Military colleges teach the lessons of deception alongside those of bravery and sacrifice, reminding officers in training that wars are not only won on the battlefield, but in the mind, engineers and scientists too look back with a mix of admiration and humility. The ghost signals of 1943 were the ancestors of a new kind of warfare, one fought in code and frequency, where the boundaries between real and false grow ever thinner. Langford's madness has become the foundation of modern electronic countermeasures, the father of jamming, spoofing, and cyber warfare. Every radar signature that flickers with uncertainty, every invisible battle fought across fiber optics and satellites, owes a silent debt to that cold airfield and its circle of misfits. Yet with hindsight, there is also unease. The same tools that gave Britain a fighting chance have become weapons in an endless arms race of perception and illusion. Today, wars may be waged not just with bombs and drones, but with data, deepfakes, and invisible algorithms. Misinformation seeps through the world at the speed of thought. Armies of hackers and shadowy agencies wage silent battles, their victories and defeats hidden from the headlines. The line between genius and folly, between a breakthrough and a blunder, is thinner than ever. Langford's story stands as a warning and an inspiration. It is a tale of daring, of what can be achieved when someone dares to ask, "What if we see the world differently?" It reminds us that, in moments of crisis, those who are willing to risk ridicule, to stand alone against convention, sometimes hold the key to survival. But it also whispers of humility, for every victory of perception contains the seed of a future deception, every truth a shadow. For those who came after, the lesson is not simply to trust technology or to fear it, but to remember the very human mind behind every invention. Langford and his team were not infallible. They were flawed, frightened, and driven by necessity. Their triumph was not in the machines they built, but in the courage to try what others dismissed as impossible. Today, as the world faces new forms of conflict, from invisible hackers to propaganda machines, the spirit of the mad scientist endures. We live in an age where the next great war may begin with a line of code, a signal bounced between satellites, a lie disguised as truth. The challenge remains the same: to outthink the enemy, to question the obvious, to guard against the comfort of certainty. And so, as history circles back and new dangers rise, remember the lesson buried in those war-torn years, that the future belongs not to those who cling to what's safe, but to those who imagine what others cannot. The true victors are not always the ones with the biggest guns or the loudest voices, but those who are brave enough to change the rules and wise enough to live with the consequences. And the next time you hear about an impossible idea, remember who really wins the war.